Welcome to our first installment of the weekly RZR Recap. My name is David Metzger. I'll be your host, and I will be joined by four fantastic analysts that each bring a unique political perspective to our conversation. First, a conservative analyst from New Jersey, AJ Malillo, an independent analyst from Florida, Chris Ravilla, a liberal analyst from New Jersey, Sophie Ferris, and a libertarian analyst from New York, Pietro Gerasi. The first thing that we want to cover is summing up the week in one sentence. So I'm going to turn to Chris. Chris, could you sum up the week's political happenings in just one sentence for us?
Yeah, the biggest thing from this week was my sentence.
Okay, AJ, what do you think? In one sentence, give us the political happenings of the week.
Hollywood and California are under fire.
Sophie, would you mind giving us a weekly recap in just one sentence?
With midterm elections creeping closer, the Biden administration and many on the left are firing new legislation in, from raising taxes on the wealthiest households to pushing long overdue social justice reforms, such as the federal anti-lynching law.
Interesting. Pietro, why don't you close us out with the week in one sentence?
Absolutely. Well, between what's happening between Russia and Ukraine, and it seems like the Russian effort is falling apart there, and everybody in a hubbub over Will Smith slapping Chris Rock, I'd say it's quite tumultuous, although I think you could say that every week in politics is tumultuous.
So four great perspectives there, and certainly gives some people some things to think about. Moving forward, I want to get into winners and losers for the week. So I'll start with AJ on this one. AJ, would you give us one winner from the week and one loser from this week?
Yeah, well, I think the biggest winner of this week is going to be the Daily Wire, because they're going out with kid content and they're trying to go against Disney, which pretty much openly said that they were trying to infiltrate kids' media and teaching them things about sexual orientation and gender ideology to young children. And I would say that the biggest loser of the week, I'm not going to say Disney, but I'm going to say clearly Will Smith. I think that that's pretty obvious, and I don't think I have to go into why.
Sophie, we'll hop over to you. Would you give us a winner for the week and a loser for the week?
Kind of right off that vein, I thought a winner for the week was Chris Rock. I thought he came out looking pretty good, and flipping that right again, a loser for the week I thought was young members of the gay and LGBTQ community in Florida. I think they're taking a loss right now and having some of their rights and abilities to express themselves taken away.
Pietro, give us your winner for the week and your loser for the week.
I think this week's winner is Larry Sharpe, New York's Libertarian Party candidate for governor, was at an event by a conservative group, and he managed to win many, if not all of them, over with his message. So he did a great job there. I think the loser for this week is the taxpayers of the state of New York, as it was just came out that Governor Kathy Hochul is going to fork over $600 million. That's $600 million of our money that was taken from us to the Buffalo Bills for a new stadium. So that makes us, the taxpayers in the state of New York, this week's biggest loser.
I didn't know that, so thank you for informing all of us. So that was a brief foray into this week's politics. I do want to get a little bit more into the most important stories of the week. With that being said, I want to start with Biden's tax on the wealthiest households. I'll turn it over to Chris first. Chris, what do you make of Biden's proposed tax on the wealthiest households? Do you think that it will do something substantial or substantive for the economy, or do you think this is more partisan politics at work?
I think this is based. Right now, I believe the recent polls have run in the Democratic kind of points to the Republican on a generic basis. This is ready. This won't pass either the House or the Senate. Now, I think Biden look to go after 1%, as his base has been clamoring for.
So, AJ, I want you to sort of parry off that. What do you make of Chris's comments? Do you agree, disagree? And what are your thoughts on Biden's tax on the wealthiest households?
Well, I'm going to be honest, David. Chris was cutting in and out for me a little bit there, so I didn't catch it all. But I'm just going to answer your second question there. When it comes to the Biden tax, I think that first of all, people are struggling to realize for some reason that the top 1% of earners pay a lot of the taxes already in this country. Actually, the top 1% of earners pay about a quarter of all of the individual income tax in the country, which is 7 times higher than the bottom 50%. The top 50% in our country pay 97% of all of the taxes. The top 1% paid 38.8% of the tax of that tax that I was referring to, and so basically, it's just another tax on the wealthy. And I think Chris had mentioned that there's a lot of people clamoring for taxing the top 1%, and I think that I think that that's fair. People are clamoring for that, but that's because people, I don't think, realize that the top 1% is basically carrying the weight and already anyway. And I also want to note that part of the Biden tax plan is talking about taxing unrealized gains. That means things like that you have just stocks that are just sitting there that you haven't actually taken any of the money out is getting taxed as if you had that money, which you don't. It's not a liquid asset. It's ridiculous on its face. And you want to talk about taxing people fairly. That's not taxing them fairly. And then they try and claim that this will help the deficit. But let's be honest, it's only going to help the deficit if they don't increase spending to go along with it, which they're clearly going to do. Because, well, every administration since Calvin Coolidge did. So,
yeah, AJ, I want to stop you there. I want to turn it to Sophie. Now, Sophie, I want to ask you this. AJ asked or talked a little bit about how the top 1% is paying an exorbitant amount of the taxes already. Do you think that the 1% are paying their fair share, or do you think that they're finding loopholes to sort of get through? And do you think that Biden's tax would help any of that?
Well, I think that it's important to note that the billionaire minimum income tax is only going to target the top 100th of 1% of American households. And it's simply requiring that the very wealthiest Americans are going to pay their taxes just like everyone else does. So I think it's fair. I think, Democrats have been pushing the Biden administration to increase the top marginal income tax rate for a long time now. This is a little bit overdue, and it's, in an effort to combat rising inflation. And it's something that at this point, again, is really only going to target that top 100th of 1% of American households.
Pietro, what do you think? Do you think that this tax is only targeting the top upper echelon of households? And do you think that that's fair to target that upper echelon?
Well, they say it's going to only target the very, very top. But that was also what they said about the original income tax when it was imposed way back in 1913, I believe, when they passed that constitutional amendment. I think ultimately any tax increase is going to come down upon the middle and lower classes, as they always do, because the upper classes know how to get their money into offshore accounts so they can avoid these taxes. And there are loopholes galore that can be exploited. And they will definitely take a look at that because our tax code is so convoluted that there's just so much there that they can exploit and they will exploit. And so they're not going to pay any of this. I have no idea how this is going to raise revenue because the rich are just going to move their assets elsewhere. And then you want to tax unrealized gains, which is wealth that does not exist. I don't see how that is going to work. I think you're going to see a sharp reduction in investments, which could have major implications for our economy.
Yeah, David, do you mind if I jump into Pietro's point? Yeah, I think that what he said is absolutely right, that our tax code is just way too convoluted. If the Biden administration and Congress actually wanted to make a difference, they would simplify the tax system. They would make it, and you want to talk about paying your fair share, they would make it a fair flat rate that everybody pays the same, hence fair share, right? And it would just be simple. Like, this is your income, this is how much you pay, period. That's it. No deductions or anything like that that would need to go into it.
Well, ideally the rate would be zero, but yes.
If I could hop in there real quick, I remember when Paul Ryan came out with a postcard to send back to the federal government, and he was roundly mocked by the establishment media as giving a TED talk to us. So to simplify things would be great, of course, but I don't know if there's the momentum in Congress right now to do much of anything, to be frank.
Sophie, do you think that we should simplify tax code, or do you think that right now the tax code isn't doing enough? I want to ask that because I think that it's important that there's a discussion on both sides about the tax implementation that's currently going on, because some people, as you were mentioning, some people talk about quite literally abolishing the IRS, and then people on the other side want to say that we need more stringent tax code.
No, I think we need to simplify the tax code, and I think that's something that people across the aisle can agree on. I think that, again, going back to the original topic at hand. This is just one of many efforts to try to kind of simplify that cash flow right now. And I think it's going to be ongoing and not something that Congress is going to push through quickly.
So that covers the economic clash going on in America right now, or at least part of it, I should say. And I want to get a little bit more into the social clash that's going on, specifically with the transgender ban in sports that is being implemented across the United States in a host of different states. Utah most recently banned transgender athletes in high school sports. Sophie, I want to start with you on this. What are your thoughts on this ban? Fair, unfair, and what are the implications for athletics in the high school level and beyond?
Yeah, so I mean, this bill came right off of the win of Leah Thomas, and it was more about toppling the success of transgender athletes than anything. And it was driving up support on a culture war issue and had very little to do with protecting women's rights and protecting female success in sports, and way more to do with, toppling the success of transgender athletes. So I think overall the effects are dangerous. It's dangerous for the transgender community, and it does more to hurt a marginalized community than to help another. And this is, it's not helpful for women, and it's not helpful for anybody. And it will create more danger and oppression towards a group that already, as we know, does not have a lot of opportunity in schools.
Chris, do you disagree that this is hurting and marginalizing an already marginalized community?
Yeah, so we talked about this a little bit in our RZR News post on the topic, but I do feel like Utah's move was a bit too rash, a bit too soon. I think they were going with the flow of the coverage from Leah Thomas. At the same time, though, I think it is important to make sure that the people who are competing in sports and kind of switching over the line from male to female, that we do make sure that it's legitimate, while at the same time it is hard to imagine that anybody is doing any of these things purely to gain an upper hand, so to speak, in another field of their competition. I think that at most people, the vast majority are doing this because they genuinely have some sort of dysphoria, and we need to be respectful of that.
AJ, I know that you talked a little bit about this as well in the RZR News post. Would you mind touching on your thoughts about the transgender ban in sports in Utah and then beyond?
Yeah, sure. I think what Chris said is absolutely right. I don't think that anybody is like trying to game the system here by transitioning. I don't think that attack is valid or fair or anything like that. But I want to note that in literally every single professional and semi-professional and college sport out there, if somebody is caught taking testosterone enhancements, it's a performance enhancing drug that they will not be allowed to play in those sports anymore. And especially when you're talking about transgender women who have had testosterone go through their body because they went through puberty as males. So testosterone naturally goes through them. And I could be mistaken on this, but I'm pretty sure Leah Thomas has not gone through full gender reconstruction surgery, and therefore still has testosterone going through her body. It seems like it's an unfair advantage for these people, and it's a shame. But the girls that are also affected, in the Utah case, it's high schoolers, but in the case of Leah Thomas, it's college age students, right? These girls are trying to get scholarships, trying to make the Olympics. They've been working their whole life for these successes, and it's not necessarily fair for them to be beaten and dominated by people that had what is considered a performance enhancing drug pumped through their body naturally their entire lives up until this point. And I just think it's simply about being fair towards women. Do I think that trans athletes shouldn't play the sports that they want to play? Of course, maybe we can come up with a way that you have a league that has trans athletes, biological athletes, and they agree that we're cool competing against each other. We agree to everything. But until that becomes a thing, I just don't find it fair to have these people compete against each other.
So Pietro, I'm curious, from your perspective, what do you think about the personal liberties of someone transitioning and competing, if it's male to female or female to male, in the sport with which they identify in terms of their gender? And does the state have any right to impose a ban on an individual simply because they want to compete in a different division?
Well, there's definitely a lot to unpack from that last comment, but the Libertarian Party has always supported LGBTQ rights since our inception 50 years ago. And no, the state does not have a right to ban anybody from sports simply because of their identity. Absolutely not. And this is certainly something that is worthy of our attention as far as school sports go. I think we do need to have some delineation here, because there is some truth to the claim that pumping testosterone through your body could be an advantage. And I'm not 100% familiar with the transitioning process. I don't know if testosterone shots are a permanent thing or is only during the course of transition. But regardless, for school sports, they should still be allowed to participate on the team with the gender that they identify with. I know a lot of sports are co-ed, so that for those teams, that should be moot. But for those that are not, I think, you should be able to play for the team with the gender that you identify. As far as something like the Olympics goes, perhaps if those testosterone shots are only during the course of transition, again, I don't know if that is the case or if it's permanent, but perhaps there you might have a holding period, whereas while you're going through transitioning, maybe you don't get to try out for the Olympics. But again, that's up for the Olympic Committee to decide. That's not up for the government to decide. That's the Olympic Committee. That's for them, not the state. The state should have no say in this matter at all. This is not relevant to any of the state's operations. The state only exists to protect our liberties, and banning athletes, especially teen athletes and student athletes, from the sports that they love is well outside the boundaries of the functions of government. And I think this is what we should be focusing on, not Florida's so-called Don't Say Gay bill, which, while it is a bad bill, it is not what the Democrats or the Republicans say it is. Again, it's also more state interference, but I think these bans on transgendered athletes are far worse than that bill that was passed in Florida and signed into law. And I think if you're going to make an uproar about a piece of legislation, it's Utah's ban that was in fact vetoed by the governor and overridden by the legislature. I think that is far more worthy of attention and far more worthy of making a firestorm over than Florida's bill, which is really almost, I don't want to say it's nothing, but it's far less significant by comparison.
AJ, I want to turn to you. Do you think that the Florida bill that was passed, and I want to stay on track here, do you think it's less or more significant in comparison to these bans on transgender athletes? Meaning, what do you gauge as the significance of these bans being passed for transgender athletes?
Yeah, I'm not really sure. Not really sure which one's more significant and which one is less significant. But I think that the banning of transgender athletes isn't necessarily significant in like a number of people it affects way, because it's such a small percentage of the population and the athletic population in general. So I'm not really sure like which one has the greater cultural impact, I would imagine is the question. And I honestly disagree with Pietro. I think that the Florida bill has a bigger cultural impact because it's dealing with what is going on inside the classroom. And I also disagree with Pietro in saying that the state doesn't have the authority or the right to legislate these types of things. You're talking about public high schools. That's pretty much right in the government, the state government's purview and local government's purview. So I would say it's a public school, it's a public high school. So I would disagree with that point too.
So Pietro, any comments or thoughts on AJ's comment that it's within the government's purview or within their right to be able to legislate on such a matter if it's at a local level or a state level?
I think it's within the government's purview to perhaps regulate to an extent curricula and teacher regulations and what schools are supposed to accomplish. I think regulating who can, excuse the phone call there, but regulating who can and who cannot participate on a sports team simply because of their gender identity or any changes that they are making to their body, I think that falls outside of the state's purview. It's not really the function of government. If we decide that the function of government, part of it is educating our youth, fine. But I think regulating who gets to participate on sports teams based on identity is not part of that, and that's I think he is incorrect there. And as far as the cultural impact of Florida's bill, he's right to the extent that there could be a cultural impact there, but it's K2 or K3. Well, once you hit fourth grade, then you can have those conversations again. You can start to talk about that, and you can start to discuss the fact that, yes, some kids do have, in fact, two fathers or two mothers. And in fact, some men grow up and marry men, and some women grow up and marry women. And I am bisexual. I may find myself in such a situation. But I really don't think it's going to be this, oh my goodness, we're destroying the gay community sort of thing. Or I don't think it's going to lead to that sort of impact or anything along that vein. I think it will delay, which is the problem. It will delay education on a very relevant matter. But I don't think we're going to see a huge shift away from being pro-LGBT, being pro-LGBTQ rights. I don't think that's going to happen. And of course, parents are still free to teach their kids whatever they like, right? So if you disagree with that, you let that in the curriculum, you can tell your kids about it yourself. School, and if you really don't like what the school is doing, school choice should be an option. You should be free to send your kid to a charter school or to a private school or homeschool your kid. I know that's not an option for everybody. It should be an option, but in any case, you are more than free as a parent to have that conversation with your kids about the fact that yes, gay people exist and are real and they're loving people, and men marry men, women marry women. And I know that's not going to be every family, but if not, then that conversation happens in fourth grade. I think while perhaps a little less ideal, it's still good that those conversations can still happen. This bill could have been K-12. You're not allowed to talk about it. That would have been really bad. So at least it's not that. So I think while the bill is certainly bad, it certainly could have some implications, it is not the worst thing that Florida has come out with.
Right. So you're arguing that the importance of the Don't Say Gay bill, which it has been dubbed by some critics in Florida, is not nearly as severe or of the same level of importance as these bans. Chris, Sophie, I want to ask any final words or thoughts on the matter before we move on.
I mean, I think just to jump in quickly, there's no way that both of these bills don't have significant consequences. I mean, both of them are about the regulation and exclusion of marginalized people from public spaces. So whether that's conversations in schools or allowing people to compete on the sports field, we're excluding and regulating a certain group of people. And I think that there will be significant effects in Florida for young people in the gay community. And I think that for people across the country in the trans community, we're setting a precedent for the ability to regulate their participation in public sports and to just exist and be at peace in public spaces.
Unlike Florida, Utah does not have Disney doesn't have a mega billion-dollar corporation that can shed light on the situation the same way that Disney is doing now. So I wonder if that sort of economic sort of emptiness there, that void there, sort of shields them from more criticism that they might otherwise get.
So moving on here, I want to cover a little bit of world politics, and I'll start with AJ on this. Obviously, the most pertinent story that's been circulating for the past couple of weeks has been Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the military conflict in that area of Europe. AJ, I want to ask you what your thoughts are on Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Specifically, do you think that it was a smart move for Russia to invade Ukraine? And if so, or regardless of that, what do you think Putin's plans are for Ukraine and the region as a whole?
Yeah, I wanted to completely note that I don't think invading a country is ever necessarily a smart move by anyone. Invading a sovereign state, I think, is bad in general. And I would say that Putin probably miscalculated here. He invaded during the worst possible time, agriculturally speaking. He invaded during their muddy season, which was a terrible calculation. He miscalculated how much the Ukrainians didn't want to be quote unquote liberated from the quote unquote fascists that run their government, even though their president and secretary of defense are both Jewish. I think it was just a terrible miscalculation. And that's why you see a lot of Russian generals dying in combat okay, because generals are really on the front lines. So I would say that it's a complete miscalculation on Putin's part. I would say that Vladimir Putin is just trying to gain as much territorial control in the region as he possibly could. He wants to reestablish the Russian Federation of, what, 100 over 100 years ago at this point. And I would say that that's Putin's biggest goal in his legacy, is to reestablish the great Russian kingdoms of the past. And hopefully he's failing. I think that Ukraine is putting up a bigger fight than he anticipated.
Now, Chris, I want to turn to you. Based on AJ's comments, do you think that Putin made a miscalculation? And if so, how do you think he'll correct for that?
I do think a lot of miscalculations were made along the way. That's pretty evident. General Jack Keane, former general, made a very great point that at some level, I think that the U.S. government, some Western governments, are sort of hoping that Putin does succeed, at least in part, so that Vladimir Putin doesn't have to go to a plan B, so to speak, a second option, that he doesn't feel frustrated and bogged down. And what happens at that point? Does he resort to chemical? Does he resort to nuclear? He certainly seems willing to open the door, or at least to keep the door open on those more severe consequences.
Pietro, I want to turn to you now. What do you make of Putin's invasion, and what do you think the United States' role should be in supporting Ukraine?
Obviously, as a libertarian, I don't like war, especially wars of aggression. Certainly, Putin made a major miscalculation. We see evidence that they were very, very unprepared for this war. I mean, it's almost comical in a way. You see tanks running out of gas. You see supply lines not being filled. You see tanks getting towed away by civilians. I mean, it's almost comical. It would be if not for the immense destruction that the Russians have managed to cause, killing tens of thousands. I don't know if it's tens of thousands, but it's a very high death toll of men, women, and children, and causing an unnecessary refugee crisis. And all for what? Because Ukraine was going to join NATO, because, Ukraine certainly had aspirations to invade Russia, right? That's what Ukraine wanted to do. So yeah, Putin definitely miscalculated and overreacted by invading the Ukraine. That was a horrible decision on his part, and I think I agree with Biden for once that Putin should not be in power anymore. But as far as the role of the United States, and certainly I think that remark by Biden is questionable as its effectiveness and how that will go about with trying to get peace talks underway and achieve peace. But certainly the United States should not go to war on Ukraine's behalf. It's one thing to send supplies to Ukraine and certainly offer humanitarian aid, offer food, shelter, supplies, that sort of thing, absolutely. But sending American troops to Ukraine is out of the question. We are not the world's policemen. It is not our job to send troops to defend everybody everywhere. We do not have the wherewithal to do that. We do not have the resources to do that. We are $30 trillion in debt. We cannot afford to another war. We can't do it. So we just do what we can. If we want to, it's one thing to supply the Ukrainian military with munitions and weapons. That may not be seen as the most libertarian solution ever, but it's a way that it's sort of a compromise that we can work out with them to ensure that Ukraine can defend itself without putting American lives at risk. And I think when it comes to sanctions, you have to be very careful with sanctions, because oftentimes sanctions end up affecting civilians more so than the government. And sanctions have a very poor track record of being effective. Usually they just worsen the conflict and rarely succeed. So if you want to have sanctions, we haven't been doing this right. We have to sanction the very top government officials in a way so that we have to make sure the sanctions only affect government officials and don't make things worse for civilians, because that's not how you end a conflict. That's how you add fuel to the flames. But certainly, yeah, Putin miscalculated. He needs to go, and we need to have peace as soon as possible, because as Chris said, we don't know what Putin's plan B is. And I'm not sure we want to know what that plan B is. I think we won't know what it is until it happens. I think we'd all rather it not happen. So peace as soon as possible.
Sophie, I want to turn to you now regarding Pietro's comments. He talked a little bit about how sanctions may not work and how they may be just possibly hurting the Russian people. Do you think that sanctions are not going far enough? that they're going too far, that we're doing the right amount of sanctions, A, and B, I also want to assess your thoughts on Pietro's comments regarding sending ammo, ammunition, troops, and so forth. Should we be sending any troops to the region, or should we play more of an isolated role?
I think it's a really tricky line in terms of sanctioning Russia. I think, as Pietro said, we need to be conscious of the fact that a lot of these sanctions are going to ultimately hurt civilians more than they are hurting Russia or Putin and Putin's, his ultimate plan. I think that he is, as of right now, kind of going to pursue multiple tactics. I think that plan B really is the scariest option. And as of right now, we need to kind of tread carefully along that line of where sanctions are going to deter Putin from crossing over that line into, perhaps using nuclear or chemical options, which is what we absolutely want to avoid, versus, where we might be able to perhaps stretch into hurting civilians a little bit with these sanctions if it means pushing off that plan B for Putin. So I think it's a really tricky line. I think in regard to your second question in terms of sending troops, I think as of right now, I agree. I think sending troops is absolutely not in America's best interest. On the other hand, I think we should be doing everything in our power to enable Ukraine to protect themselves in the best way possible, whether or not that means giving them the equipment to create a no-fly zone or giving them whatever materials they need to protect themselves. And I think, the next step then comes to seeing where Putin draws the line with our NATO allies. I think that once Putin or if Putin does dare to step into NATO territory, that is when the prospect of possibly having American troops enter warfare becomes, more realistic and, in the best interest of Americans.
I also want to ask Chris and AJ very briefly to wrap up this topic. Sophie talked a little bit about a no-fly zone, and I just wanted to cover that idea. I'll start with Chris, and then we'll turn to AJ. Chris, first, just in a sentence or two, no-fly zone, yes or no?
Personally, I'm going to say no because I think it draws us deeper into the war. I did find it interesting, though, that, of course, our liberal member of the panel did mention a no-fly zone when the Biden administration basically scoffed at the polls for offering MiG-29s, which would have facilitated such no-fly zone. If the Ukrainians want to do it themselves, that's fine, but I think NATO needs to stay out of it.
No fly zone means the United States and NATO are at war with Russia. And the same poll that said that a majority of or a large amount of Americans were okay with a no-fly zone, once it was explained to them that a no-fly zone means we were shooting down Russian planes, they said, absolutely not. And the opinions switched on it. So the no-fly zone shouldn't even be entertained. And quite frankly, it might sound strange coming from the conservative on this show. That is the best thing that the Biden administration has probably done their entire time in office, is that they have said, absolutely no boots on the ground. Absolutely no, we won't be shooting down Russian planes. So I do have to give props where props is due. And so that no-fly zone is a terrible idea.
Finally, let's also turn to Pietro. Pietro, no-fly zone. What do you think?
Well, a no-fly zone would certainly be effective, I think, in helping to resolve the conflict. But ultimately, if Ukraine wants a no-fly zone, it will have to establish a no-fly zone. And it'll be up to the Ukrainians to do that. Because if you have NATO establishing a no-fly zone, as you all said, it would involve shooting down Russian planes, which would absolutely draw us into a deeper conflict. And we really cannot afford that on a number of levels. So unfortunately, the United States is unable to commit to a no-fly zone. And so I agree, yes, President Biden made the right decision there. And again, Ukraine is going to have to establish that no-fly zone if they want one. We cannot do it for them.
Both said this, and I'm not sure what language Sophie used. I might have missed it, but they both said deeper conflict. I want to be crystal clear. This doesn't mean deeper conflict. This means World War III. Okay? It's not a deeper conflict. It is World War III.
Certainly a possibility.
The final topic that I wanted to touch on is one that probably has implications in terms of the United States' judicial system and pertinent rulings for decades to come, and that is the nomination of Judge Jackson to the Supreme Court. Now, I want to start with Sophie on this. I want to talk about the congressional hearings that were occurring with Judge Jackson. Do you think that the line of questioning was fair or reasonable from conservatives, or do you think that it was largely partisan and more of an effort to drum up support amongst their base?
I think that every congressional, I think in every Supreme Court hearing, there is opportunity to drum up that base. I think that there were efforts to do so on both sides. And when I reflect on the hearings of Amy Coney Barrett or Brett Kavanaugh, I do not think that Ketanji Brown was treated, particularly harshly. I think she was obviously questioned in a way that, put her both her professional experience, her familial experience, her personal experiences out to bear, but not in a way that was any different than how Amy Coney Barrett or Brett Kavanaugh were. I mean, we went into Kavanaugh's high school history. We went into all sorts of religious questions with Amy Coney Barrett. So I think when we put all of that into perspective, it seems like actually a pretty fair series of hearings.
AJ, I want to turn to you now and ask you about the questions that were asked by the conservatives in Congress, specifically as it pertains to child pornography cases. The Republicans in Congress made a very big deal of those cases. What do you think about the importance of that? Do you think that the questions were warranted? Do you think that citizens should be concerned about Judge Jackson's rulings, or do you think that this is more overblown and overhyped?
Well, I want to start by saying thank you to Sophie because for having the clarity on the issue that she just put out there, because I think that she's absolutely correct. And I think that a lot of people on her side of the aisle would kind of toe the party line there. And I want to thank her for realizing exactly the truth, that these aren't necessarily out of the ordinary. But when it comes directly to the child pornography questions, I think what's important to note is when Senator Cruz was asking her about the sentencing of these child pornography questions, Ketanji Brown Jackson was the sentencing judge, right? So that means she was the one making the decision for how long these people would be behind bars. And I think to note that she was putting people behind bars for possessing and distributing child pornography for an average of 47.2% reduction of what the prosecutor had asked for and what the what the minimums were. What's the word I'm looking for?
Federal guidelines.
The minimum guidelines. That's the word I'm looking for. Were almost a 50% reduction from those. I think that's important to note. And it goes deeper to an ideology that Judge Jackson clearly subscribes to, that notes that, possessing child pornography is different and should be handled differently than participating in the creation of child pornography. And that's a, judicial debate for another day. But I think it's fair to ask. I think that ethics questions, when it comes to putting justices on the Supreme Court, these people are serving lifetime sentences. And I'm going to go a little bit possibly out of school and say that you see how ethics are important when you look at the decisions of Justice Clarence Thomas, who probably pretty clearly should have recused himself from the decisions about January 6th, especially with now we're finding out his wife, Ginny, has a lot involved in this decision. He should have recused himself, but he didn't recuse himself. I think ethics is really important when you're talking about a lifetime position. And I'm not going to chastise Clarence Thomas as an unethical man, but I would say that I would have made a completely different decision and recused myself if I was in his shoes.
So, Pietro, you've also written for RZR a couple of times about Judge Jackson's record, about her decision-making. So I want to ask you, what do you make of the congressional hearings, these accusations about child pornography sentencings, and what do you make of Judge Jackson as a nominee?
Well, I think I'll start with that last question. Judge Jackson has very impressive credentials. I mean, I think she wrote a paper while at Harvard, and rarely do these papers have any effect. But I think this one that she wrote, and I forget the exact type of paper that it was, but it was referenced a lot, like several times, I think, by judges in real cases, which is, again, is a huge rarity. And she was she's on one of the federal courts, Court of Appeals, I think, right? And so, and she's been very heavily scrutinized before. And again, I think she has a very impressive list of credentials and will certainly be a fair justice on the Supreme Court, even if some of those rulings may be a little biased towards the left. But again, we see that from all the justices, so that's not particularly unusual. As far as the hearings have been going, there are two main things worth highlighting. One was a question, somebody asked her, what is a woman? And she sort of just shrugged it off because it was sort of a gotcha question. It was a dumb question. It had nothing to do with one's ability to engage in jurisprudence and decide cases. And if you really think about it, you know, the question of what is a woman could be an entire lecture at Vassar. Like you could have a whole class around what is a woman if you really wanted to. And you know, there are. It is not actually just black and white. Maybe this is the Vassar and me talking, but you know, it's not just two X chromosomes that define a woman. There's so much more, and even biologists will tell you this. There's so much more that defines a woman. You know, what do you mean? What is a woman? Do you mean by gender? Do you mean by sex? Do you mean how does society define a woman? What sociological pressures exist on women? And there are all those. Wow, I really do sound like a Vassar student right now. But there are those. You could delve into that whole big conversation. It's not just a simple answer, though. You could certainly do the simple answer. I don't know. I'm not a biologist. And then there was some people mocking her. Candace Owens was mocking her on that, which was really nonsensical and totally missed the point. It was just a gotcha question that was unnecessary and had nothing to do with her qualifications. But then the other part, which is perhaps the bigger part, which is the insinuation that Judge Jackson is friendly towards pedophiles and lets them off easy. I don't think that argument, that accusation has any validity. Yes, there was one case that caused me a little bit of concern where there was this 18-year-old who pled guilty to having images of child pornography, and he was sentenced to, I think, 3 months. I think that sentence should have been longer. Certainly, I think that one may have been a mistake, or it was a mistake, but her rulings on her sentencing on these cases have been consistent with what other federal judges have handed down. And in fact, we've seen prosecutors ask for less sentences because they agree that the sentences are often too harsh. And these are coming from prosecutors, and prosecutors have been under scrutiny for being overzealous and just going for the maximum penalty at the expense of defendants. And sometimes the defendants deserve it, sometimes they don't. But even they're saying that the guidelines are way too strict and are way too harsh. And again, Judge Jackson's rulings have been consistent with other judges. And if there's one thing courts really love, it's precedent. They love precedent. So I think your issue, or some of your issues, may not be so much with her so much as with precedent. So if you think that these sentences should be longer, that should be taken up with the Sentencing Commission, which she was a part of, and she had a hand in reducing guidelines elsewhere, especially for drug offenses, which is really good. But I think ultimately your problem is with precedent more so than with Judge Jackson, and that's where you should take your case. And again, obviously she's not a libertarian's first choice for judge, but I think certainly she'll be good. And if we do see a shift over to the liberal side, the balance shifts, that we could really see some interesting rulings come out, because I think she is a bit more to the left than her future colleagues are. And we'll see what happens with that. It's hard to say right now what her rulings will look like on the Supreme Court. But again, I think they'll be fair. I think they'll be well thought out. I think that they will be ethical. And I think a lot of these concerns that Republicans have brought up are unfounded and are really just there as a way to drum up the base, as a way to fundraise and spread fear. And I think if we want to talk about ethics, I think the Republican Party and those senators need to look at themselves, and they should ask themselves if they're being ethical, because I would think otherwise.
So, Sophie, I want to turn to you for the last word, just briefly on this matter. What do you think Judge Jackson will be like on the Supreme Court, as she will likely pass through and be sat. What do you think she'll be like as a justice on the Supreme Court?
Yeah, I think, that was a great perspective from Pietro. I think, all of that definitely is right on par with my perspective on how Jackson performed in her hearings. And I think that she'll be a reliable liberal judge. I think that, it's obviously historic to have the first woman of color be sitting in such a high position of power. And it's something that will be, in our history books for years and years to come. So I think the notability of race and her gender obviously was contentious throughout her nomination, but I think will also be something that will mark her as both a judge and as a historical figure, obviously. So I think she'll be reliable, and I think that her identity, as much as it may be contentious to say, will play a key role in her ability to make decisions on behalf of an underrepresented community in America.
The last thing that I want to end with here is that covers our main stories for this week. I want to go around and ask each of you, because this is definitely aligned with the ethos of RZR News, is something that you took away that might have changed your mind a little bit or your perspective on a certain topic from another analyst today. So I want to start with you, AJ. Tell us one thing or one takeaway that you had from another analyst today that sort of made you, even if it didn't fully change your mind, made you rethink a certain perspective that you hold.
Yeah, I want to say, first of all, thank you, David, for putting this together. And thank you for all of the other people on the panel for being such terrific guests. And I just want to say that I think that a lot of what Sophie said was really interesting to me. Obviously, it's a liberal perspective, and technically, the liberal and the conservative should be pretty much opposites. And it kind of started out that way. But I think that there was a lot more common ground that you might have seen between the two of us than maybe what originally thought. And meanwhile, I would say that me and Pietro had a little bit more disagreement than I expected, being the conservative and libertarian, where you would think that those two things would align more. So I think that it's good to see people having these different perspectives and disagreeing, but being able to do so civilly. And I just wanted to say thank you for everyone for being civil and having a productive conversation, I think.
Chris, I want to turn to you now. Give us a moment from today that changed your mind, or at least made you reconsider one of your own viewpoints from any of the topics that we discussed.
So I thought that Pietro brought up a really good point when we were talking about Congress at times reneging on their promises, bringing up the amendment of that brought us the first income tax. So that definitely made me reevaluate Biden's proposal.
I want to then turn to Pietro. Pietro, coming from a unique libertarian background, was there something from the other three perspectives that made you change your mind, or was a point that you wanted to maybe reevaluate going forward?
Well, certainly, I think I may have been a little too dismissive of the effects and impacts of Florida's Don't Say Gay bill. It might be worse than I think it is, and I'll have to pay attention to the fallout there. Hopefully, it's not a huge deal, but I think that there is some accuracy to what the other panelists said, that, in fact, it might be more problematic than I realize, and I know I can be a bit dismissive of things at times. It's something I need to be aware of. So I thank them for bringing that up and putting that in there, and I'll look into it more. Certainly, thank you, David, for putting this together. Thank you for everyone else for joining. This has been a lot of fun. But IJ said he was surprised that we had some disagreements, but that I think there is a common misconception that conservatism and libertarianism are almost exactly the same. And in fact, that's not true. And hopefully this sort of showed that and demonstrated that. Libertarian principles span the political spectrum. We are pro-gun, we are against war, we are pro-LGBTQ rights, we're pro-school choice, and we're also pro-immigration. We don't want to deport folks who have entered this country illegally. So we do, and we are also a pro-choice party. And you can find more information on our platform, www.lp.org/platform, which will really lay bare most of our beliefs. And you can certainly learn more about what the party believes in and find more information about us at lp.org. Once again, thank you everyone for doing this. It's been a lot of fun, and I look forward to doing more of these.
That was great. Thank you. And I want to finish now with Sophie. Sophie, one thing that you took away from today from another one of our great team of analysts.
Yes, thank you, David. This was great. This kind of goes right off of what you said, Pietro. I think it was really interesting to hear more about the libertarian perspective, and I definitely, appreciated hearing about your opinion on the transgender ban in sports, and hearing, just now, as you mentioned, just kind of having the progressive social agenda worked into the libertarian policy platform, which is something that I think we could all understand and learn more about. So I appreciated hearing more about that, and definitely learning more about your perspective on a couple of those issues.
That just about wraps up our first ever installment of the RZR Recap. We'll be posting on a weekly basis, and I hope you all tune in. Thank you so much for watching.